All right, we're going to talk a little bit about animal care review panels. I am with the Center for Food Integrity, and I'm not sure how familiar you are with the center, but we are a member organization with a focus on earning trust in the food system. So we don't advocate or lobby. We don't say this system is better than that system, but we do believe that there is a lot of education that needs to go on out there, and so we advocate for just a more informed conversation. It is not uncommon for retailers to call us to say, okay, we're getting this pressure from a consumer, multiple consumers, help us think about this. And while we realize it was not, we were not the experts, and we do not want to necessarily say this is the way to go or this is the way to go and this is the right thing and that's the wrong thing, we thought it would be better to call on experts. Two of our panelists are here today. You know, Dr. Janice Swanson, yeah, all right, and John Deen. Thank you so much. And they have served on several of our, well, they are on our standing panel, but they have also given input to several of the reviews. And so I think we had one that we were going to print, and I think Ernie is going to check on that. Let's just talk about how this process works. So we've all seen the whole hidden camera thing, and really this is focused at retailers because I think activist groups see that as the weakest link. And so they know that they will cave under pressure, much like we heard just a while ago. And so in order to give them some information, ammunition, we put together an animal care review panel process. It gives timely response from experts because this has been a successful strategy. When you think about the whole undercover video and animal abuse and the picture that that draws for the unknowing public, it's been effective. But this provides a balanced approach and analysis to the videos. When we hear about a video, we often see just a clip. Before we start any of these panels, we always go back to the organization. We ask them for the complete and unedited version of the clip. We have never been successful in getting that, but we ask every time. Also, test the legitimacy of the video. And it engages experts. And what I mean by this is each panel has a veterinarian, animal scientist, and an ethicist. And they're all coming at this from different angles. Animal health, animal husbandry, and ethics. And it demonstrates a commitment to do what's right. I think we all know that the industry is committed to doing what's right for the animal. I don't think the customer fully understands that. I know retailers do not. And so it's not always going to matter what science says. As we've heard earlier, it's going to be what the consumer is demanding. Because if you look at it from a retailer perspective, their objective is to sell more product. And so if a consumer has certain expectations, they're going to work to deliver. So we talked about the makeup of the panels. And we try to issue these reports within 48 hours. And you're going to say to yourself, oh my gosh, how do you do that? We're going to talk a little bit about that process. There's a lot of work that has to be done before that video is released. And the panel operates independently. Normally we find out about an undercover video from sometimes the activist group, sometimes from a retailer because they have been contacted, but also sometimes we find out from the commodity group. So the commodity group has to be pretty committed. And they have to be pretty confident in their industry and the practices because we will draft this report and release it without sharing it to the commodity group. So very important that everyone understands it's independent. And to maintain that credibility, it has to be. So let's talk about what happens. So before the video, commodity group comes to us and they say, listen, we anticipate this is going to happen. It's happened before. It's going to happen again. We need a way to talk about this. So we will assemble a panel. Now, when I say a panel, I don't mean one here, one here, one here. We have a list, and I'll share the standing port panel with you, but we have a list of animal scientists, a list of vets, a list of ethicists. We do that because as soon as we hear about an undercover video, we're going to start calling and we're going to say, we're going to need you on standby to do timely review of this and share your input. And that's exactly what they do. And we have had some that would say, no, I don't want to be a part of this, but most are committed to doing what's right and to giving their input. They recognize that they are the authority, and so they don't have any problems sharing exactly what they think about the practices that they've seen. Here's our standing pork panel. So you'll see we've got Janice Swanson and John Deen here with us today. They'll share a little bit about their experience, but how does this process work? First of all, we got a video. It comes out. Now keep in mind, once it comes out, this panel is already established, and so we are just sort of on standby, waiting for the video. We start calling as soon as we hear about it. We may not have the video, but we'll start calling our panelists to say, be on standby. So then we get the video. We call, and we ask for the unedited version, and then they say, we'll call you back, and we know they won't, so we continue. And then we contact our panelists, and we share with them a clip of the video. Okay? Everything that we have and everything that we know. And then the panelists share their opinions. Keep in mind, these are very busy people, and so while we'd like to have a conference call, we don't always do that. That's, for the most part, impractical. So we call them individually. What is your input? What do you think? They tell us. And then we will draft the report. And once we draft the report and we've got that information, we send it to them and we say, have we truly represented how you feel about this? Now keep in mind, we're under a tight deadline here. So this is quick turnaround. And they say yes or no. And it's not uncommon for them to say, I don't know, I don't understand what he was saying or she was saying in this. We encourage them to talk. We've had a couple of times that we have had individuals that did not agree. And that's okay. We don't want them to agree. We want their unbiased input. And so then we will share the report. We share the report with the retailers. Most of the time that list is provided by the commodity group. We'll also share it with trade media, and we'll share it with the commodity group at the exact same time. Now, I always like to say don't break into jail. I think it's very important that as an industry we respond proportionately. And so if you just look at each one of these little segments as 24 hours, the video is released and we begin the panel assembly process, and then we have media coverage. Now this is when the actual video is released, and what we have seen is when we monitor media, we normally have a spike within that first 24 hours. And then we either have no spike after that, or we have, trailing media. But for the most part, this is within the food and animal sectors. So once we have shared this with trade media, it's not getting a lot of pickup. We then have to decide, do we share this with mainstream media? And most of the time, we don't, for the simple fact that nobody is picking it up. Nobody's picking up the fact that this video has been released. They're not sharing it. And so why in the world would we want to make a media sensation out of something that isn't already getting traction? So, the use of these, I agree, is important. I think it serves a critical need in our industry, but we've got to be very careful about the process. It's not about the report. It's about the animal care and how the consumer views that. So, very important to keep in mind, we don't want to overreact. But we always tell commodity groups, and this is nothing new, this is not anything insightful. I mean, is to analyze the practices through the eyes of the consumer. That used to be, something novel. It's not anymore. All commodity groups do this. So when we say this, you're probably thinking, yeah, you got a firm grip on the obvious. We do, because it is through the consumer's eyes that we have to view animal care these days. So I'd like to assemble our panel. If they would come up. We've got Dr. John Deen from the University of Minnesota, Janice Swanson, Michigan State, and I think each of them have a presentation. Okay.
Okay. Just a bit more background on myself. I grew up on a hog farm in southern Ontario, practiced in a town called Shakespeare on the Avon River, just down the road from Stratford, rather idyllic. And I've been involved in pork production for most of my life. This was an opportunity that came up in my professional career. I cut my teeth on something called the Boss Hog series in North Carolina, where there was an expose on hog production, and in fact, the News and Observer in Raleigh won the Pulitzer Gold Medal, the top award for reporting for the activities. And as it evolved over time, it became more a critique on animal care as well. And we had to learn and understand how to respond in a more cogent manner. And this is a real opportunity to solidify our arguments, to put it out in a strategic manner, as mentioned, to decide whether or not to respond, and to coalesce some of the diversity of opinion that we have in our own community in hog production. So welcome it on that part. I want to add to the discussion 3 points on the after effects. Number one is, once this comes out and it is made public, we do interact with the media afterwards. And my aim is to explain the complexity and to not allow the media to take it down into simple points. One example is gestation stalls. Pretty well every video says that Europe banned gestation stalls. Well, those of you in the know understand they did not. They limited their use to certain times of gestation. And I go into that and start explaining the complexity, and I'm successful when the reporter's eyes sort of glaze over. One of the measures is not only whether or not it's picked up in the media, but whether I'm successful in not perpetuating that discussion in the media. There's a second audience, however, and it's our own producers that have been struck by the criticism, and sometimes, frankly, really hurt, and in some cases, really want to make changes in what's being done. One short story is we had a producer in Minnesota that was found to use some methods or allow employees a breadth of loading hogs that was not, of methods of loading hogs that was not acceptable. And so the first thing we did, I went out with the manager and loaded a truck of hogs ourselves, a semi of hogs ourselves. It was hard work. It was hard not swearing. And one of the first rules we make, it's just my bias, is to make a swear jar on every hog production facility. The last thing we need on a video is people swearing. And I do an exercise with my students. Watch it without the sound, watch it with the sound. And there's real differences there. And we have to, and in turn, after loading the hogs, we asked, how can we make this easier? That there are systematic problems in hog production that we can address once the focus is in place. The other community, and it's getting less and less, in my opinion, are the critics, the activist organizations, the phone calls, the emails, the blogs with saying nasty things about you. The thing I learned there is the question is not my technical skill, but my intent. And describing my intent and ensuring that all critics understand that care is my business is a major part. In some audiences, whether it's the League of Women Voters, I may need to wear my Birkenstocks instead of my blue blazer. In other audiences, I just need to explain background and switch to a narrative rather than my scientific output. But combining those, I wish to thank CFI and other groups for solidifying our approach. My observation is there's less and less out there. I think it's partly due to the producers and their response and the structure that they've created. But I think it's also due to the presentation and the maturation of our understanding what critics and the public actually expect to hear from us. I'll leave it at that. Janice.
I don't know if I can improve on what you just said, John.
Well, thank you for inviting me here today, and I guess I can actually very much agree with a lot of what John's observations have been with regard to this issue in general. I think both of us started into this business many, many years ago, over 25 years for me, I hate to admit it. But watching this whole process evolve in the conversation about animal welfare, my disciplinary training, my scientific training is in animal behavior and with a focus on food animals in particular. John's is veterinary medicine. And I don't know that either of us thought we would be entertaining the types of questions that we had now than we did when we started into our careers. It was a matter of keeping animals healthy. In my case, it was a matter of studying, looking at how we could advance production and so on, using the behavior of those animals to do it. But what I've observed is that there is now more of a multidimensional approach with regard to not only animal protection groups and how they have grown in their sophistication of getting their points across. I'd say politically, number one, used to be their approach was totally through the legislative system. And typically we had either a Congress or we had a legislature within the state that had occupancy, a high occupancy of ag-related individuals that were representing them on those in those structures. And we could always count on them blasting this down. The approach is now very different. The minute they started into the conversations with the food retail community and being able to exert pressure there and then being able to work through that pressure to open their eyes, because in many respects, I know John's probably worked with them as well, they're not necessarily aware. If they know the product they're selling, they know what they need to do, but they never felt culpable for what happened at the farm level. And that changed significantly. And suddenly you had the suits in the office in downtown Chicago, for example, getting connected with what was actually happening at the farm or happening at the slaughter plant. And having to explain that, and I know many of us who were asked to be engaged in those scientific advisory councils really sat back for a moment and said, do I really want to get engaged with this? Because this is frightening to me, professionally, to think that I'm going to walk into a McDonald's or somewhere else to do that. But then the question came back, well, if we don't do it, who else is going to walk in there and sit down with them and speak about these issues? So I think in many respects, having veterinarians, having ethicists, and many of us have ethicists sitting at the tables when we do this, and ourselves in animal science, has been very helpful for giving them the full scope and the full understanding of what does happen, or what does it take to raise animals on a farm, what types of things do happen, what is common practice, what is not, what's the science that is evolving under those conditions. And I think we also bring this perspective into the classroom as well. It's difficult when you're working with the type of social media that we have today that can be launched in a nanosecond. You can't control it. You can't refute sometimes some of the images that you see. And being able to put that into context in a way that sometimes what we end up saying about it is not something that necessarily the industry is going to enjoy. But I do see, and I've sensed and I've watched industry themselves change with regard to the conversation. It used to be, no, hell no, we're not going to talk about this. And then finally coming to the point where we got to talk about this. We've got to take a look at this. Is this really actually happening on our farms and ranches? And what is it we can do to be able to put those into place? So I was quite pleased, about 15 to 20 years ago when the different commodity and producer groups started to put together guidelines and have those conversations, and a number of us were used ad nauseum in that. I thought if I ever saw another scientific advisory council, I'm ready to retire. However, I think the conversation has broadened. I think our farmers and ranchers have become far more sophisticated in engaging in that conversation, actually engaging in the science, seeing the recent changes with regard to looking at having assessments on farms, being able to tolerate having a third-party auditor, and so on to come in and verify. And even though we would like to think, as we did maybe 50 years ago, nobody had to do that, we're just living in a very different environment, and it's not going to get any easier. Probably one of the broadening the discussion a bit more is to look at this from a systems-based perspective as well. It's not just animal welfare. It's a matter of looking at these animal production units as a system, and you have a system that has a multitude of issues that operates within that. And so I don't know how many people are familiar with the Coalition for Sustainable Egg Supply. It was a project, a public-private partnership that came together to be able to look at the different types of systems that we understood that our industry would be gravitating to. Not in particular was the egg industry. But looking at it from a multidimensional standpoint, because many times when farmers and ranchers are asked to make these changes that are solely based on animal welfare, there are other implications for other parts of that system that we may not talk about. Using litter in an egg layer system certainly accommodates the types of behaviors we'd like to see accommodated within that system. However, you also have higher density of dust, you have particulates that can carry more bacterial load, you have it being exhausted into the air. Farmers are expected to apply with the EPA standards as well for clean air. You have food safety standards that come in with regard to the integrity of that eggshell and whether or not you're going to have or risk contamination of the eggshell. There's a multitude of things that happens. You have the workers within that system that have to even breathe the air that in fact may affect them with regard to their pulmonary. And so I know for me as a scientist, I view this more in a complex system status now than I did in a single dimension status with regard to what is the animal doing. It's not only what the animal is doing, but it's how well is the rest of the system doing as well. And how do we sustain these systems so that farmers can still make a living, that we are accommodating for the things that are important to be accommodated with regard to animal welfare, but also are we not putting them into a catch-22 with regard to the other compliance issues that they need to be able to meet with regard to the production of food. So I've appreciated the CFI model with regard to this. I know we've had the opportunities to work together. I know in the early days I never looked at a video, particularly because it was usually PETA or somebody calling me to look at the video. There was no way, number one, I couldn't tell whether they broke into the facility. I didn't want to be part of a criminal activity. I had no control over what the quality of that video was. I had no idea if there was editing. In some cases, it looked like those videos were taken in much older facilities. I didn't do it, but under a more controlled scenario where there is an intermediary that is assuring, for example, if we can get the full video, let's get it, that I have other colleagues that are engaged in it, I feel much safer in terms of being able to render an opinion there, but also understand that it's going to be filtered correctly with regard to its release as well. So that's all I'm going to have to say.
Thank you. I'd just like to share, Dr. Deen, I remember the Boss Hog series, as a matter of fact, because I'm on that whole 25 years in the industry thing too, Dr. Swanson, so yeah. It's a reality check. But I remember I was working at Murphy Farms when that was released, and it was very, very painful. We didn't know what to do. That was a first time for us. As a matter of fact, I think there are a lot of jobs today in the industry that did not exist at that time simply because the industry has evolved so much. And so given that, I come from a farming background, you will come from a farming background, I am interested to know how many times have you found that there has been actual abuse versus just unattractive best practices, as we like to call them?
That's a fair question. I'm not sure I can give a percentage on that part, but actually early on it was mostly abuse. It was a criticism of the actions of workers on the farm. And unfortunately, we can find cases where there are people or there's complainants who have worked on the farm that have pointed out quite, in some cases, egregious activities. And I remember some of the early videos out of North Carolina that we had to point out and make that a point. What has happened is that the activist groups who have made the videos aren't interested in critiquing the individual anymore, because that they don't find that it affects changes, and so they're creating criticisms more of the system and more of aspects that they feel that, especially those holding brand equity, can actually force change, whether it be housing systems, whether it be, in some cases, euthanasia and transport. And so I think it's actually the critics who have changed the weighting within those videos.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree. Dr. Swanson, do you find anything different?
Yeah, I think the early days, and I would agree with John on this, the early days, it was the most egregious acts that you typically would have caught on film. And in many cases, it would lead one to think that actually there were people inside the operation that were also upset about this and actually had contacted organizations on the outside. I think that was true in the North Carolina case, that they went to PETA or they went to HSUS or they went to one of those Mercy for Animals, and they actually gave them the lead that this was happening on this facility, I can't stand it anymore, do something. And so they would infiltrate, and that's the way it happened. These days I'm seeing far more of the standard agricultural practices being brought up, castration, dehorning, things like that are being criticized and looked at. I know in some of the videos we've looked at, some of these were standard practice, and they have been accepted practice. And either AVMA, Federation for Animal Science Societies, and others have found that to be an acceptable practice. So now it's going to the level of the actual agricultural practices as well. The other addition to this, I think, is the environmental piece that is frequently being brought up more and more, particularly water use by agricultural animals, the conflict between what we reserve for human use and what we have for animal use. Some of this is being exploited out of some of the water wars that are happening across the country. You look at California. I remember in Kansas, it had to do with the feedlot industry in western Kansas and the Ogallala Aquifer, the Republican River debate that continuously goes on, and also looking at the Rio Grande going into Mexico and it's drying up and how it's being used and pulled off for agriculture, is frequently being more talked about and brought in. For example, even on our college campuses, we have a lot of discussions that go on with respect to this. Many of us who have law schools have units now that are animal law units, and some of them have glommed on to being vegan is what's going to save the world from, it's going to save your freshwater resources, it's going to save, a whole lot of other things. So people want a simplistic solution to all these issues, and unfortunately there is no simplistic solution. In parts of the world, animal protein is incredibly important to these individuals with regard to their own nutrition. So I think, really with regard to these, in the beginning, I'd say a lot of them were centered on just out and out abuse. These are things that should not be happening. I know it's happened here in the state of Ohio as well. We've had dairy farms exposed and so on. Now they're starting to move into that area of just standard agricultural practices that may have been accepted for a long time, but they find to be obnoxious. So I can't put a percentage on it either. They're all different.
That's fair.
Yeah, they're all different.
Yeah, and no doubt it has evolved. I think you all have a copy of an actual panel review, and so I shared this one with you. I realize it came out in 2013, but this actually had input from Dr. Swanson and Dr. Deen.
Yeah.
So, long time ago.
It was just one of the uglier ones that we had to look
Exactly, but I mean, let's look at the good, the bad, and the ugly. I grew up on a farm as well. And what I have seen, and I worked in the pork industry for some time, but what I have seen is that now that I work in an association, I find that I'm working with a lot of individuals that did not grow up on a farm. And so when we would get a video like this, I would look at it and I would see things very differently than they saw them. And so when we would always say, look at it through the minds of the consumer, I honestly thought that's what I was doing. But in fact, I must not have, because we had employees that would say, I can't look at that. And I know that for a fact it was just a standard best practice within the industry, but they could not even view the video. It was so disturbing to them. So that looking through the eyes of a consumer is not always as easy as it sounds. One more question I have, and then I promise I will let others ask the question. But how many abuses that you've seen, or maybe best practice, could have been avoided had we had timely euthanasia?
This is a tough one. It's one I think we have to work with farmers and ranchers on all the time. Inherently, I think most of us don't want to have to make that terrible decision of putting an animal down. All right? For some, it's easier than others. But there's always the idea in the back of the mind that maybe this animal will recover. Now, it can be put into dollars and cents, or it can be put into the fact that this is a valuable animal to the herd, and in fact, or flock. We don't want to do that. It's a little bit like, not completely like, making the decision to put your dog to sleep, right? A lot of it centers on our experience, and we're focusing more on what we're feeling and not necessarily what might the animal be going through. We don't want to put this animal to sleep. We don't want to, it's that sort of thing. So the destruction of an animal is not an insignificant thing. However, what I find is sometimes they don't quite know when to pull that trigger and make the decision, because they don't know when we cross over from the time, and I think John will agree, when we cross over from the time of being recoverable and non-recoverable. And I think having a decision tree, something that somebody could grab onto to get to the point where they can, and I know there's been some of those developed too, that says, at this point this animal is non-recoverable, you need to put this animal down. And it gives people permission to go ahead and do it. But I know a lot of farmers and ranchers don't like having to go through that decision process in terms of putting the animal down. It's a loss in profit to them, but it's also a loss of a valuable member of their herd, of their flock. And that's when the ugliness starts, is when you have an animal suffering. They're sitting out in a sick pen somewhere. If someone's not paying attention to that sick pen, because sometimes it's easier if they're out of sight and out of mind, those are places that people will gravitate to take that video shot. And you need to really make sure you pay attention to those sick animals, that you take care of them. If you think they're going to be in a recovery status at some point, take care of them to that point in a way that you can actually recover that animal and get them back into the herd. But there's a lot of them, I think, that happen that way.
I'd add, I don't think in my experiences in most cases that the videos don't focus on timely euthanasia as an issue,
no,
because the activist organizations don't want to be associated with euthanasia and arguing for higher rates of euthanasia
right.
on the farm. So it's more just that quick clip
right.
that indicts the farm, and we need to get rid of those illustrations, and it comes up time and time again in our assessments within National Pork Board PQA Plus as a major issue. Two points. Number one is we need to have a sensitivity over the issue. Mm-hmm. My mom would say, "Can you look at crate number 14 in the Fairing House?"
Yeah.
And she didn't say anything more, but you knew she wanted me to euthanize the pigs. That I'm not sure we can completely combine an ability to euthanize animals and the care that we expect on the farm, but we need that capability there. And frankly, we have problems, especially on the weekends on
Right.
some of our farms. So we struggle with it, and we need to discuss it and make it part of our discussions on the farm. The second point is, and it's hard to explain, especially a market hog of 200 pounds, you're using methods of euthanasia that are equally effective on humans.
Right.
And so the safety issues need to be discussed. And it's an interesting discussion if it gets out into a public domain on how we keep it safe and still make it efficacious and easy to do. And we are in a conundrum. Again, my complexity argument.
Yeah.
No, it is. It's very difficult. We have questions from the group. Yes.
Do you work with your forensic video analysis? And what is your process for referral to the justice system?
We don't have anybody that works on the forensics of the clip analysis.
So, because somebody mentioned you thought things had been edited and perhaps not quite reflective, and obviously that's a very strong law enforcement interest. And I thought you might have it with Leva or someone.
No, but what we have found is that as you look at that video, it doesn't smoothly progress. You know what I mean? And so you will have clips of this and clips of this. As far as the justice piece, no, we have not referred anyone. We do not do that. But certainly we would hope that the commodity group would look at this report and say, yes, this requires a larger and much greater step as far as animal abuse.
Do you reflect that the video is probably not accurately reflecting the conditions?
Yes.
Now?
If that's what they say. Yeah. I mean, we only synthesize their input, and we have to do that to make sure that it maintains credibility from the experts.
And I might add, we only talk about what we actually see. And we try to be as clear as we can about what we see. And if we have any reservations about what we see, we try to express that in the thing, saying that it could be we're not positive that this is happening. This may not be reflective of what.
The video to like the law enforcement video analysis team.
Well, we don't get involved in the law enforcement piece.
No,
Typically, these have
don't
gone.
think the video's accurate. Can you reflect that in the report?
Well, we don't. We talk about it in a reserved manner, but we don't actually know unless you get the full clip. All right, from the organization, it's difficult to do any kind of forensic work. So what we talk about is what we actually see based on the clips as they're depicted. It's up to somebody else to, if it does go into law enforcement, in some cases they do, this is something that's been reported out to law enforcement, then that's up to law enforcement to be able to look at that and the lawyers and whoever get involved with it to see whether or not they can secure the full length of the video and so on. But at this point, CFI has no power to get that from them. It's only if they're willing to give that all up.
Because I think that's an important point. If you're just viewing a very narrow piece of it, that makes the report more
Yeah.
narrow.
But they can only comment on that.
That's all we comment on.
Any other questions? Yes.
Just a follow-up to that. So if that piece, that clip you're looking at is basically falsified, should you comment on that at all legally? Or should that first be evaluated, or that, what if it turns out that it's a false clip, it's all been staged? Has there been any action taken privately by a producer against that organization, because that is basically misinformation?
To my knowledge, no. Are you all aware?
We had seen some of those, but I know I've seen several, and it came out later that it was all staged. So I'm always wondering, why has nobody ever pursued any legal action against, say, an animal activist group that has falsified information against the producer?
So I think there was at one point, but it wasn't on the farm. I think Barnum and Bailey got into something with regard to one of the organizations in which they made that allegation, and I can't remember how it came out, but I think they ruled in favor of Barnum and Bailey because of the nature of that and the misrepresentation of what they were doing at the time.
And unfortunately, that's probably a financial issue. I was wondering if somebody would want to address that. But you look at the money that goes into some of the groups that may be taking those steps versus what a producer or farmer would be able to hire for legal protection.
Yeah, and it may be difficult, and this is just Allyson's speculation, okay? So take that for what it's worth. But it may be difficult to quantify the true loss from that video.
Yeah.
So, yes, no, sure, Arnie, go ahead.
I think as it relates to that, if you've noticed or paid attention to the news in the last week or two, you all remember the lean, finely textured beef situation.
Oh, yeah.
Pink slime, and the fact that that is actually being taken up, and it's either a North or South Dakota courtroom here over the next few weeks. I think the outcome of that and what the monetary value, if there's a monetary value that's been placed on it, but if anything comes to fruition, will determine, how some of these other future situations play out. I do think it is a monetary situation, and how deep the farmers' pockets are compared to the organizations that are attacking them, that ultimately makes the decision what it is for the farmer to not move forward. So I do think that outcome on the lean, finely textured beef deal
Will be a turning point.
I think so, yeah.
Yes, go ahead.
Do you prefer that whoever gives you the video for analysis and you're looking at it and you think, hey, this doesn't look quite right. You don't know that it's been staged or whatever. Do you have a way of referring them to, so they know to go have an analysis done in the video?
I think there's 2 points. Number one is, first of all, going back to the farm and asking, did this happen? Is the first measure. And we usually don't have time to do a complete analysis with the farm owner or the farm managers of what has happened. But in retrospect, frankly, I haven't found any that have been staged. The real question comes up with the plant who's doing the filming, whether or not that person has adequately represented the law and inhibited those activities, or in some ways allowed them to go forward. And that's a consistent question, because often there's a lag of 6 to 8 months between the time of the filming and the release, usually associated with a shareholder meeting or something of that sort. And who has the responsibility of that lag if the complainant actually states that this is an illegal activity? And it's actually been pretty handy to take that lag and say, even HSUS doesn't consider it that important.
Because they delayed in releasing the information.
Yeah,
So if you were truly concerned, why did you not bring this to our attention immediately?
exactly.
Okay. And I understand your question about the analysis, and I think it's a legitimate concern. But I would say, if you look at it from a retailer standpoint, they have been shared that piece of the video, and it is only that piece of the video that they're going to react to. And so that is what we try to address. Even if they did an analysis and they found perhaps this is staged, the damage is done by the release. And so it needs to be addressed by professionals so that at least the retailer has some recourse to tell consumers, listen, we were concerned about that too, and we had experts look at it. Here's what they found. And we are addressing this. We'll be glad to share this with you. There were concerns in the video, and we will be addressing that with our suppliers. And lots of times that is enough for a truly concerned consumer. But we have found that the activist groups are hijacking this process. And so they're getting their own video and they're getting their own experts and have used some of our experts. Which they're not really our experts, but experts in the field. Yes, sir.
Just one of the frustrating things that we deal with here in Ohio with our livestock care standards, which are law, is that we often overlap with our humane societies. Our local humane societies deal with animal abuse. and we deal with the care standards. And it's frustrating in that humane societies kind of have their hands tied because it's very rare you'll get a prosecuting attorney that will prosecute. It's very frustrating.
That's because it's expensive to prosecute, particularly agricultural animals. I've seen that.
Yeah.
When I was in Kansas, I saw that. They can't, because they have to take the animals into custody. They have to feed them. And they don't typically have the resources to do it.
Yeah.
I know in Canada for a long time they had their farm animal care councils that actually worked in tandem with the humane societies. And what they did is they set up a hotline in which, if there was suspected problems on a farm, for example, if someone shut the doors because of economic problems and the animals are starving inside, someone suspects that they could call into the hotline, and it would mobilize both members of the Humane Society and the agricultural community go out and try to take care of this. Or they knew of a farmer in trouble, for example, and they would mitigate that before it actually got to the stage where animals were starving, and tried to sort of take care of it before it actually became a huge problem or immediate one. So I don't know if that's something that you can form in Ohio.
We work in tandem with humane societies. The problem, what we've seen over the last couple of years, is that humane societies are involved. We'll go out with them as well, but they don't feel they have the backing to go forward with it. That's the issue.
Yeah, that's
so what we end up getting is all the phone calls into us instead of the humane societies.
Yeah.
And our penalties are civil penalties; they're not criminal, and so it just really is frustrating.
Yeah, and that is a problem. It really is.
Now, are the humane societies that you're referring to tied into HSUS?
No.
No. All of ours are county humane societies.
Sort of like what we would call an animal shelter.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Yes.
I'm interested in the changing tactics that you talked about from the activist groups. Why do you think that's happening? Why is there a change? And it's a little leading, but do you think it's because consumers are becoming more numb to these shock videos, or is there another reason that's at play?
Well, I mean, I guess just from the history of it and watching it evolve over time, there was a time when we did have conversations in the ag community with an entity like the Humane Society of the United States. There used to be people within the Humane Society of the United States who actually were devoted to agricultural animals and many times had a background in that. I think what happened over the years is the digging in of heels, not wanting to entertain those hard conversations, and then the building of frustration. So when the opportunity came and there was somebody savvy enough to recognize that there needed to be a different political process that was followed, inserted themselves into that organization, they changed the whole complex of that organization. And so what used to be an organization you could dialogue with and try to move the ball a bit, became one that said, heck, we're tired of doing that. We're not moving the ball the way we want to. So what we're going to do is fire all the science people within the organization and replace them with lawyers. And you had some examples that were already set with regard to the use of the, in this case, it wasn't necessarily the food retailer, but for example, the cosmetic community experienced this a long time ago when a gentleman by the name of Henry Spira, who was handling, I think it was Animal Rights International at the time, but he used a kind of a soft blackmail approach with Revlon and the rest of them, Procter & Gamble, in which he wanted to have the conversation with them. If they shut the door on them, he ran a full-length ad in the New York Times, "We blind bunnies for the sake of beauty." That was his. And this happened in the 80s. And it was very effective at bringing Procter & Gamble, Revlon, and the rest of them to the table to start talking about the use of animals in testing for things like cosmetics and so on. And as a result, they came together and they put together a center at Johns Hopkins University called the Center for Alternatives to Animal Testing. And there they came together and funded projects in which they were able to do things. Well, it set in place an idea that we don't need to use the legislative process. We just need to go to the bigwigs who actually buy or produce those products and make them responsible for what happens to animals at that level. So, after he died, what happened is PETA picked it up, and they started into this, and very slowly it got picked up by others and said, we're going to have a conversation with McDonald's, we're going to have a conversation with Burger King, we're going to have a conversation there, and we're going to move somewhere with this, because suddenly they're going to have to look at it and they're going to have to change it. So it started with the slaughter industry back in the late 80s, and then it's progressively moved from there. And they have moved the needle, no doubt about it. They've moved the needle.
I just add that I think we have a conflict in the argument with critics. I think that critics want to argue systematic problems in animal agriculture and focus on the system. And so I think we are seeing a bias away from focusing on individuals, including charging them, and focusing on systematic areas and really a vilification of decision making. Not even the actual decisions. Industrial agriculture is like industrial medicine. And we got to come back to an argument that animal agriculture is made up of people.
Right.
Every time I go now to a meeting that is trying to criticize animal agriculture, I try bring along a caregiver from a farm in Minnesota, because it's much more difficult to vilify individuals than it is uninvolved corporate citizens and shareholders. And we're going to play that back and forth, I think, for the next while.
I think so too.